Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is on political parties and interest groups in the election system in the United States. Interestingly, political parties, we have a two-party system in the United States, meaning that there are two established political parties in the United States, the Republican and the Democrat. And while there are other smaller third parties, there's really no true legitimate alternative in terms of major election wins in the United States. We have a two-party system. Interestingly, the founders of the country, like George Washington, didn't envision a two-party system, and they actually thought that that would be a really bad thing. And the reason that they would have believed that was because of interest group politics, because of the fear that that particular political interests would pursue politics for their own end over the interest of the country as a whole. And so they really sought to avoid the kind of political infighting between different interest groups that a party system would entail. They hoped that the country could avoid that and make decisions as a whole on the interest of the country. As a whole, they did not foresee the development of political parties that would be individualistic and often self-interested. And that was a big surprise to many of the founders. And of course, a two-party system developed, and it developed almost immediately. The question why does it develop is in a way quite simple. A two-party system developed for a number of specific reasons, but by and large, it was because there were passionate individuals that strongly disagreed about things. The development of the two-party system, and I have pictured below Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because Jefferson and Hamilton kind of embody the development of the two-party system in the United States. Hamilton and Jefferson both possessed viewpoints that were very much the opposite in terms of the desired direction for the country. And Jefferson was George Washington's Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's Secretary of Treasury. These two had differences when it came to the young United States. Should the United States associate itself with Britain or France? France was a revolutionary republic, like the United States in a way, and Thomas Jefferson, oftentimes referred to as a Francophile, eagerly wanted the United States to associate with France. By contrast, Alexander Hamilton, who's a business-minded individual, in some respects, almost a monarchist, but Alexander Hamilton thought that the United States should align itself with Great Britain, that was the best interest of the United States to becoming a strong international power. So disagreements over who the United States should associate with, the British or the French, was very significant in terms of why the two-party system developed. Let me just put this stuff up here. There were differences in terms of how leaders at this time thought the United States should advance. Should it become a continental power, westward expansion, or should it become an international, more European power, which is more what Alexander Hamilton sought? There were also fundamental differences in the United States relating to the Constitution. The Constitution was a federalist document, and for practical purposes, that meant that the Constitution was establishing a government, a federal government, that was effectively the supreme government of the land. And many of the founders of the country feared that because the revolution was a reaction to strong central government. And many feared establishing a strong central government. Many in the country believed that states' rights, that states should be more powerful than the federal government. But the Constitution was a federalist document. And effectively, the Constitution's powers were such that it overrode the powers of each state. So some founders were concerned about that, like Patrick Henry. Some founders were concerned with how to interpret the Constitution. What kind of powers did the federal government possess? issues like should there be a United States bank or not. These were all really important questions. And so the point is that a two-party system was not envisioned by the founders of the country. However, a two-party system developed in the country immediately, and it had to do with fundamental differences. And the two-party system became a vehicle for various factions to voice their differences of opinion. And some of these were strong supporters of a federalist system, strong supporters of associating with the British, strong supporters of establishing a strong federal government that would maintain stability and would maintain a stable economy and could regulate international trade. Others believed that the United States should be a loose Republican country in which states had the supreme power, in which the federal government had less power, in which you couldn't establish a bank, in which the United States would move westward, but would also disassociate itself with Great Britain, and at the very least associate itself more with France. And so there were really fundamental differences very early on in the direction that the country should take. And this led to the establishment of the two-party system. In the 1790s, by the way, the two parties were the Federalist Party. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, for example, were some of the most principal figures in the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party believed, fundamentally in a stronger central government and in an interpretation of the Constitution that allowed for the government to make laws that were necessary for establishing a cohesive and stable United States. The other party was the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, which effectively is the origins of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party that we have today doesn't come about until the era of the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. The Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party at this time was a party that believed in a kind of a loose confederation of states. It believed in smaller government. It believed in more states' rights principles, and generally was more critical of the strong federal approach taken by individuals like Alexander Hamilton. In the United States, we have a winner-take-all system. For the winner-take-all system means that the party or the individual, the candidate that gets the most votes wins the seat. Winner-take-all. If you win, you get it all. There's a difference though with some parliamentary systems, and pictured here is the British Parliament. The British Parliament's based on a proportional representation, and so what that means is, in a proportional system, if you are, say, a third party, and your party, say, wins 14% of the national vote, then you get a relative percentage of seats in the parliament. And so in Great Britain today, there's four parties. There's the Labour Party and the Tory Party, and those are the two big parties. But then there's the Liberal Party, and there's I think it's called the Constitutional Party, I think is the name of the other one. But anyway, there's four effective parties in Great Britain, and while there's two main parties, two parties that would have the ability to appoint a prime minister, the Labour Party or the Tory Party, the Conservative Party, there's four really functional parties, and that's because the parliamentary system in Great Britain is a proportional system. And what that means is that if you're a third party and you get 10% of the vote, then you are awarded a proportional amount of representatives within the parliament. And so that allows for third parties to have a stake in the political process, even when they only represent a smaller minority. By contrast, in the United States, we have a winner-take-all system, and that has a tendency to lend itself to a two-party system, as the winner in the elections, the victor gets all of the spoils, if you will. So if you are the Green Party in the United States election and you get 4% of the vote, it's not really significant. You're not going to be awarded with any voice in the U.S. Congress unless you had candidates who specifically won an election. In the United States, we have national party conventions, and these are where the nomination of a candidate occurs. Of course, today these are more like kind of symbolic events. Historically, national party conventions actually were times in which the parties made their decisions about who they're going to nominate. Today, when the national party convention happens, it's already pretty much known who the party is going to nominate. But it's there where the formal nomination occurs and speeches are presented in support. And of course, each party will present its own platform. And the party platform refers to the kind of key critical issues that the party and its nominee represent. Issues pertaining to healthcare or immigration or to abortion or to foreign policy, so on and so forth. Today, Americans are actually quite distrustful of politics and political parties, and this has a lot to do with developments over the last 40 years or so, from distrust that came from corruption and lies during the Vietnam era with presidents like Richard Nixon, and also the increasing involvement of corporations, of political action committees, and of lobbyists and interest groups in the United States government. And this has created a sense among many Americans that they no longer have a voice in the government, and that in many respects the government no longer represents their viewpoints primarily. That's just a general perception that many Americans hold today. And this has to do with, it's not fundamental to our system, but it has to do with certain changes that have come about over the past 40 years or so. And that has led to increasing development of independence. Bernie Sanders, of course, who's running for the Democratic nomination right now in 2015, Bernie Sanders is an independent, and that means that he's not an independent. He's running for the Democratic nomination, but historically Bernie Sanders is an independent, and that means he doesn't associate with either political party. And that was to a degree out of a resistance to partisanship, which has become increasingly common, the idea of associating with a particular political party. And partisanship was a reason why the Founding Fathers, one, didn't really desire to have a two-party system or a multi-party system, and two, why they thought it might be negative. Partisanship means you owe your allegiance to your party. And the founders of the country hoped that people would owe their allegiance to the voting populace and the country as a whole, not to their political party. And so in some cases, independents like Bernie Sanders are resisting partisanship and the problems that are associated therein. The United States government, and this is not a new phenomenon, by the way, interest groups. I'm sure you all have heard of interest groups. Interest groups are special interest groups that represent corporations or labor unions or particular single issue things. The National Rifle Association is a single issue group. An example of a very powerful single issue group who lobbies members of Congress to promote laws or to resist laws that they see as affecting their single interest. And interest groups were another thing that the founders of the country were concerned about developing, because they were concerned that you would have these singular interest groups who would use politics to pursue their own end rather than allowing politics and the government to function for the best interest of the people as a whole. Interest group politics is very old. During the 1800s, interest group politics was sometimes referred to as the spoils system, meaning that to the victor go the spoils. And in that respect, what that meant is that if you won the election, then you had a right to kind of put your supporters in power. And that was practiced with pretty common occurrence in the 1800s. There was actually a president in the United States who was assassinated and killed because of interest groups. His name was President James Garfield, and he was assassinated in 1881. The assassin was a guy named Charles Guiteau, and Charles Guiteau was associated with an interest group. The interest group was known as the Conklingites. And the way that politics worked in the 1800s was that if you were part of, say, the Conklingites, then you would support particular candidates. And the idea was you would support these candidates, and when the candidate won, they would in return give you what you wanted, which was oftentimes a nice cushy job in the government. Well, when James Garfield was elected president, his vice president was a member of the Conklingites, and James Garfield refused to play what was called the patronage game. He refused to kind of hook up the interest groups, the individuals who supported him, and the individual who assassinated Garfield did it because he believed he was going to make the vice president a Conklingite president, and that would then send the spoils to his political interest group. Ultimately, that vice president, Chester Arthur, passed the first law trying to limit this patronage system, as it was called, interest group politics. So interest group politics has been a problem in the United States for a long time. Many Americans today see it as a fundamental problem because there are specific lobbyists and interest groups who seek to influence the government for their own interest, but not for the interest of the American people as a whole. Some of the big groups I mentioned, the NRA is a huge single-issue group. Of course, corporations have formed into super PACs, and they use super PACs to support the candidates that they think will pass laws, or that they hope to lobby to pass laws that they see as in their interest. Interest groups work by providing contributions. They will provide various forms of contributions to political campaigns. Sometimes they bribe politicians, in the case of the Jack Abramoff scandal that happened about several years ago. And interest groups often work through lobbyists. And a lobbyist is an individual who represents an interest group, and they go to political candidates and they offer support in exchange for various contributions, and so on and so forth. The lobbyist interest group phenomenon, many Americans have come to see as something that's very kind of undemocratic, because you have these moneyed interests in individuals that are going to politicians to get politicians to pass laws that are not in the interest of America as a whole, but are in the interest of a very specific interest group. Oftentimes, politicians will serve as an elected official, and then after they lose an election, many of them will go right back into being a lobbyist. And so there's a revolving door of an elected candidate and a lobbyist within the government. And this has led to a lot of Americans to, again, have a great deal of distrust over the political system, or a sense that the political system doesn't really represent individuals, but rather it represents particular specific interests, which was something that the founders were, again, deeply fearful of. Today, of course, campaign finance has become an increasingly significant issue. And recently, with the Citizens United decision that happened recently, in the formation of what we call super PACs. PACs are political action committees. And what a super PAC does is basically a super PAC creates an independent organization, a nonprofit organization. And Citizens United basically said that this was legal. It was a Supreme Court case that Chief Justice John Roberts overheard. And it's the Citizens United case. If you guys haven't heard of it, it has been referred to by former President Jimmy Carter as effectively creating an oligarchy in the United States. Oligarchy means rule by the rich. Well, anyway, the Citizens United decision and the development of super PACs basically has allowed for corporations, for big moneyed interest, to form themselves into organizations that they say are nonprofit organizations. And these are called super PACs, or also PACs, political action committees. And these groups raise money and support the candidate that they choose, but they do so independently. And doing so independently is legal in the United States. And this is legal under the Citizens United decision, if I understand it correctly. If they were to directly align with one candidate and support them directly, it would be illegal. But as an independent organization, as an independent political action committee, they can raise as much money as they want and use it to produce, for example, um, um, campaign films, for example, that might slander a particular candidate. If that's not associated with an individual candidate's funding, and that's just an independent organization, they can do that as much as they want. So it allows for the creation of basically unregulated amount of independent expenditures. And many Americans have criticized the Citizens United decision, including the former President Jimmy Carter, because it was seen as kind of opening up the floodgates to unregulated expenditures by corporations and business interests that want to control and direct the U.S. political process by flooding the campaign system with money so that they can support the candidates that they wish. And they do this largely through what are now called super PACs, in which large moneyed interests form themselves into these nonprofit organizations to basically create massive amounts of legal independent expenditures. Interest groups have been considered a political problem for a long time, and they've been associated with cases of corruption for a long time. In the 1800s, there was the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant had given large uncontested contracts to a railroad construction company. It was like an inside job, so that the railroad construction company, in association with the Republican government of Ulysses S. Grant, could basically have a large uncontested contract for building a railroad. The Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s was a case in which an oil tycoon got on the inside of the government and was able to lease federal oil reserves illegally. And of course, most recently, the case of Halliburton, in which Halliburton as a corporation was able to insert itself through Dick Cheney into the government and gain large, lucrative contracts for rebuilding Iraq that was highly profitable to that company. So interest groups are oftentimes, when they become involved in pressing the decision-making of leaders, of elected officials, interest groups have increasingly been associated with scandal and corruption as they pursue their own interests and they pursue politicians who will facilitate those interests. Anyway, went a little bit long today, guys. I hope that's pretty clear. See your book and send me an email if you have any questions, and see your book if you need any more clarifications on this stuff. All right, guys, let's have a great week.